Hello everyone. Tonight we're about to step into a story that is horrifying, forgotten, and so strange it might keep your eyes wide open until your eyes themselves start to itch. Imagine an emperor so powerful, he didn't need to fight enemies with a sword, but instead waged war against holy images. A man so devout he ordered all images of Christ to be scraped off church walls, only to end his life lying helpless as maggots began to feast on his rotting eyes. No, this isn't a horror movie. This is a dark chapter from the Byzantine Empire, a story so grim it will make you both grateful for modern medicine and suddenly curious about what paintings are hanging on your own wall. If you think you've already heard your share of disturbing tales, well, sorry to say, tonight we're going even deeper. You won't survive, at least not in the gentle sense of the word. Before you lie back and get comfortable, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you truly enjoy what we're doing here. And where are you listening from? Leave a comment and let me know what time it is for you and where in the world you are. Now, turn off the lights. Maybe turn on a small fan for some gentle wind in the background, and let's drift together into tonight's journey. You're lying there, wrapped in a thin blanket, the fan humming softly in the corner of the room, and you have no idea that over 1,000 years ago, there was another man lying in silk sheets, surrounded by the dim flicker of candlelight and walls as cold as stone. The only difference is he was an emperor, and his body was rotting away day by day. Constantine V, the name sounds like a quiet figure from a textbook, but don't be fooled. You're about to meet a man once seen as the pillar of the Byzantine Empire, both a hardline reformer and a living nightmare in the daydreams of monks. He was born amidst smoke and dwindling food supplies during the Arab siege of Constantinople, a child brought into the world in literal war. Historians still debate whether those early conditions planted the seeds of a life haunted by power and divine punishment. And of course, being the son of an emperor during a time of chaos wasn't quite the same as being a rich kid on Instagram. Constantine was forged like iron and fire, riding horses from a young age, studying theology like a monk, and speaking like a true Roman orator. Imagine this. If you were forced to memorize multiplication tables as a kid, he had to learn why venerating icons was considered heresy in ancient Greek. One curious and little-known fact. His nickname, Copronymos, roughly translated as the dung-named, supposedly came from a rumor that he defecated during his baptism. Whether that's true or not is still debated by scholars, but the nickname stuck to him for life, like a label no one could peel off. When his father died, Constantine was just 23 and immediately faced a coup led by his own brother-in-law. That's right, ancient family drama didn't need TikTok to be messy. Two factions fought for power, and the conflict wasn't just over the throne, it was over images. The rebels supported icon veneration, while Constantine firmly said, "The war dragged on, blood was spilled. Let's keep that word at a PG level." And eventually Constantine triumphed. But if you think he was merciful afterward, not quite. His brother-in-law was blinded. Monasteries that resisted were looted, monks were exiled, and any remaining icons still hanging on walls were probably hidden so well they'd make great 3D illusions. Again, some scholars today still argue, did he truly believe that religious images were a spiritual threat? Or was religion just a convenient excuse to clean out institutions that could oppose him, like wealthy, independent monasteries with the power to write many handwritten criticisms? From an administrative standpoint, you have to admit, he was skilled. He reformed the army, rebuilt the tax system, repelled invaders, and even revived the empire's finances. But you know what? An empire where people have to hide sacred images behind cupboards or engrave them on the bottoms of bowls out of fear might have surplus grain, but still lacks peace. Then came the slow withdrawal of vitality from the emperor. It started with some leg pain, then sores on the legs, then strange rumors that something was crawling inside him. Modern medicine suggests he may have suffered from severe infections, diabetes, or even parasitic infestations. But back then, people believed this was divine punishment, especially after a monk claimed to dream of him being dragged to hell by saints, a scene heavy on drama, yet very common in religious literature of the time. Another unbelievable but recorded detail. Some documents say that as he lay dying, his eyes were clouded, festering, and someone found maggots in his eye sockets. Of course, this could be exaggerated, or a metaphor used by monks to paint a more interesting death. After all, it's a nighttime tale, we shouldn't make it too dry. Surrounded by clouds of incense and thick curtains, Constantine was no longer a reformer, no longer a warrior, just a lonely, agonized man afraid. Afraid of the dark, afraid of the sacred images he once destroyed, afraid of whispers he no longer knew the source of. One night, he ordered all remaining icons in the palace to be burned. He ate from plain iron plates, rejecting even floral patterns, fearing they might be secret religious symbols. Do you see? When the most powerful man begins to fear what he once dismissed as invisible, that's when you know you can't burn memory, no matter how many paintings you destroy. To be continued. If you're still awake, let me take you even deeper into the final chapter where the body of an empire may not rot, but its soul has been scraped clean, layer by layer, like the frescoes on church walls. Are you ready? We'll continue once you've shifted your position, pulled the blanket up, and let the fan become the background music for ancient secrets. Right now you're in the state many call the dream between sleep and waking, except in this dream we won't meet princesses or heroes. We're stepping into the foul-smelling sick tent of a dissolving emperor, body and spirit alike. In the year 775, while the Byzantine Empire was still tormented by religious civil war and threats of invasion from the north, Constantine V, the emperor who once ruled with an iron fist, was being betrayed by his own body. Historians describe him as no longer able to walk, only sitting or lying down, his flesh covered in sores, his vision fading until he went completely blind. Some accounts are vivid, claiming his eyes were swollen like rotten grapes. At this point, you might feel especially grateful for your wide-awake eyes. The imperial physicians of the time, men who definitely hadn't studied at Harvard, tried everything. Poultices made from goat's milk and vinegar, searing his legs with hot iron, massaging him with wine and resin. But as you know, when someone believes they're being punished by heaven, no prescription can cure them, especially when the emperor suspected his own doctors of poisoning him. And here you see a strange truth. Absolute power doesn't make you safer. It only makes you lonelier. Constantine began replacing all his closest courtiers with military officers, fearing the aristocrats would betray him. He banned monks from performing rituals, afraid they were praying for his death. Even naming children after saints was forbidden. There was a time when a servant was executed simply for wearing a necklace with Saint Nicholas on it, a keepsake from his mother. You see, even a necklace could become a charge. Perhaps the most chilling part isn't the fevers, the sores, or even the tale of maggots in his eye sockets. It's the unraveling of the mind. Some nights, the emperor screamed, haunted by dreams of saints he had once forbidden, now appearing in silence, just standing there, watching. It's a bit like that feeling when you know you've done wrong, and someone's stare pierces straight through you. Only in this case, the stare came from burnt paintings, from exiled monks, and from memories that couldn't be erased. Modern historians still debate what illness truly killed him. Some say complications from diabetes, others suspect a rare parasitic disease. There are worms that really do eat human eyes, no joke. But everyone agrees on one thing. Whatever the cause, his death became a symbol. For those who venerated icons, it wasn't just the fall of a man, but proof that no one can defeat the memory of a people. One overlooked detail. Constantine's funeral was conducted with full imperial ceremony, but no one wept. There was no grand memorial mass, no crowded prayers for his soul. His coffin bore no images, only inscriptions proclaiming victory and imperial glory. But within a few years, the tomb began to crumble, forgotten and unvisited. Stories spread that whenever someone tried to hang a sacred icon near the grave, it would fall without explanation. Maybe it was the wind, maybe damp walls, or maybe something that didn't want those images near him. Do you notice it? It's one of history's quietest tragedies. A man who spent his life erasing memory ended up being defined by it. And in the end, he didn't leave behind statues of grandeur, but whispers of maggots, of gazes, of a dream that never found peace. If you're still listening by now, you're probably tucked in, the lights completely off, and the fans spinning steadily. Part of you might be wondering, wait, am I listening to a history story or am I dreaming? Don't worry. That hazy feeling is the signature of nights when memory quietly awakens. And if you listen closely, somewhere in the wind, you might just hear the whisper of a long-gone emperor who learned a lesson we, too, might need to remember. You can command everything, but you cannot command memory. Now you're lying still, breathing slowly in the dark, and you might feel your mind hovering somewhere between the present and the past. The sounds of the night begin to fade, giving way to a single question echoing in your head. How does a person become like that? Why would an emperor, born into silk and power, die blind, alone, and forgotten? To understand that, we must go back to a freezing winter night in the year 718, within the fortress-thick walls of Constantinople. At that time, the Byzantine Empire was in dire peril. Arab forces were besieging the city, supply lines were cut, and death hung over every rooftop. People ate tree bark, the guards didn't sleep, and mothers whispered prayers in corners, prayers directed at holy images that their sons would one day forbid. It was in these conditions that Constantine was born, not to lullabies, but to the crash of catapults and the amber glow of Greek fire, the inextinguishable weapon his father used to repel the enemy at sea. And yes, his father was Leo III, founder of the Isaurian dynasty, a brilliant general from the poor regions of Syria. Leo wasn't born of royal blood, had no noble lineage, but he possessed what an age of crisis demanded most: the instinct to survive. He led the defense during that siege, and with Greek fire and the harshness of winter, he saved the empire. Can you imagine the pressure on Constantine's shoulders? To be the son of a wartime hero, born amidst flames, named after the founder of Constantinople becoming king, wasn't a dream, it was a command. From an early age, Constantine was trained to be an emperor. There were no games, only warfare, theology, and lessons in power. While other children learned horseback riding for sport, Constantine learned to survive insurrection. While you were hugging your teddy bear to sleep, he at that same age was riding to battle beside his father. Leo III was the one who initiated the iconoclast movement, and Constantine grew up under constant instruction that the worship of images was sinful. Many later believed that he wasn't merely taught, but programmed into being a tool of political theocracy. No one can say for certain whether Constantine truly believed it in his heart, but one thing is clear. He lived as though the whole world was wrong, except for him. When Leo III died in 741, Constantine was just 23, still young, but already accustomed to palace conspiracies. However, power didn't come to him as smoothly as one might expect. During his ascent, his brother-in-law Artabasdos, the commander of the Anatolic army, suddenly rebelled. With support from the church and icon worshippers, Artabasdos declared himself emperor. And thus began a civil war not just of swords and soldiers, but of ideologies. This was no longer about the throne. This was a confrontation between two worlds, one of sacred images and one of their destruction. And you already know in battles like that, the victor needs more than military strength. They need a cold heart. After 2 years of chaos, Constantine retook the capital. There were no warm reunions, no dreams of reconciliation. Only a chilling parade. Artabasdos was blinded and paraded through the streets in shame. The monasteries that had supported him were sealed, destroyed, or confiscated. To Constantine, this was not revenge. It was a purge of what he considered heresy. From that moment on, no one called him prince anymore. He had officially become Emperor Constantine V, ruling with an iron hand, a steel heart, and eyes once described as sharp as blades before fate slowly began to strip their light away, bit by bit. And perhaps you're lying there thinking, if he had been born in peacetime with no war, no religion twisted into political machinery, would he have turned out differently? Maybe. But the Byzantine Empire was no place for soft hypotheticals. In that world, history had no room for gentleness. And so, Constantine V ascended not as a fairy tale prince, but as a tragic figure from classical drama, born of blood, raised by steel, and dying by maggots. You're still there, aren't you? Your body relaxed, your head tilted slightly to one side, but your mind seems to be swimming slowly through warm waters of the past. That's all right. It's a common sensation when you go deep into a story that isn't just history. It's a strange dream of power, faith, and silence heavier than 1,000 trumpet blasts. After reclaiming the throne from Artabasdos in 743, Constantine V was no longer the promising young emperor. No, he was now a lion with scars, who had smelled betrayal and never wanted to smell it again. From that victory, he began to reshape the empire in the image he believed was pure, not morally pure, but pure by his own definition. In 754, he convened the Council of Hieria, a religious synod with no Western bishops and entirely devoid of icon supporters. Unsurprisingly, the council issued a death sentence for sacred images. Icon veneration was declared heresy, and with that, Constantine now had religious justification in hand and the right to burn. From here, the empire entered one of the darkest chapters in Byzantine spiritual life. Frescoes were scraped clean. Small statues were melted down and recast as military medals. The names of saints were banned from being given to children. There were priests who, refusing to destroy icons, had their hands slashed or had images of saints nailed directly into their palms. Imagine living in a world where even hanging a picture of the Virgin Mary in your kitchen could be seen as treason. And then came the monasteries, the last bastions of intellect and traditional faith. Constantine began dissolving them en masse, confiscating their property, exiling monks to hard labor, or forcing them to remove their robes and don armor. Yes, he turned monks into soldiers. Not because the army lacked men, but because he wanted to crush the spiritual resistance at its root. A little-known detail. During this period, many scribes secretly buried relics, icons, and manuscripts beneath floors, inside hidden walls, or wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed under wine cellars. Some were destroyed, but many survived and centuries later were unearthed again like seeds of memory planted during the harshest winter. You might ask, and what about the people? How did they react? Oh, they bowed their heads, at least outwardly. Because when the ruler controls both the church and the army, silence becomes a means of survival. But inside kitchens, behind wooden doors, under oil lamps, stories continued to pass. A monk beaten to death. A painting that bled after being stabbed. A strange dream where St. George descended and said, "He who erases my face shall lose the light from his own." Modern historians still debate. Did Constantine do all this because he truly believed he was protecting the faith from corruption? Or was he simply erasing every symbol beyond his control, a form of centralized theocracy? Perhaps both. Perhaps he believed he was right. And perhaps that's what makes this story so terrifying. Meanwhile, in political and military terms, there's no denying he was one of the most effective emperors of the 8th century. He restructured the theme system, creating military administrative districts capable of defending themselves. He strengthened the eastern borders against the Arabs, stabilized the Balkans, improved taxation, built bridges, repaired roads. Administratively, he was a fresh wind. You see the paradox of power, don't you? A man can be both a savior and an oppressor, both the builder and the one who burns. On one side, a brilliant strategist, on the other, the destroyer of icons. And in the empire's stifling silence, only the church bells still rang from time to time, not clear whether they were praying for him or warning that something was rotting from within. Now, you may close your eyes for a bit, or not, because in the next part, we'll step into the final years of Constantine's life, when his body began to say what the empire dared not speak, that no power is stronger than memory. And that one day, the very things he tried to erase would return in dreams, in whispers, and in eyes that no longer held a pupil. In the quiet room, under the thin blanket and the steady hum of the fan, a part of your mind drifts into a place where time is no longer linear, where memory and fate weave together like red thread in a Byzantine tapestry. And at the center of that tapestry is an emperor stepping into the final chapters of his life, where power begins to fracture and the body becomes the last battlefield. In the 760s, Constantine V was still strong in military and political terms. He launched successful campaigns against the Bulgars, secured the Danube frontier, and rewarded loyal soldiers generously. But inside the palace, cracks had begun to appear not just on the stone walls, but on his own skin. No one knows exactly when the first symptoms began. Some said he started to limp. Others swore they saw him gasping for breath, climbing the steps of Hagia Sophia. Court physicians whispered that his leg was ulcerated, festering, and had to be wrapped daily in wine, ash, and resin. But do you know what's strange? The entire empire, the vast machinery of governance, chose silence. Because in Byzantium, a sick emperor wasn't just a medical concern. It was a political danger. A sign from the heavens, a warning that the throne might soon be vacant, and in a court built on fear and absolute loyalty, admitting that the emperor was decaying day by day could be considered treason. And so, a strange circle was formed. Courtiers pretended to see nothing, physicians prescribed increasingly bizarre treatments, and Constantine growled in the dark. He began to suspect even those closest to him. A nephew was placed under house arrest for wearing a saint's medallion. A loyal bishop disappeared after advising him to rest. Even his dreams turned against him. He saw Saint Stephen appearing, holding a blood-soaked cross, saying nothing, just watching. And in those fevered trances, a whispered question echoed, repeating itself through corridors, through the curtains. If he once burned holy images to erase memory, what will memory do to him when he no longer has the strength to resist? By 774, Constantine could no longer walk on his own. He was carried on a stretcher, veiled in curtains, surrounded by great censers to mask the stench. Courtiers whispered of small creatures seen around his wounds. Maybe ants, maybe maggots, maybe just the visions of a decaying mind. A strange note appears in secret manuscripts. During one bandage change, insects were found in his eye sockets. Whether this was a medical reality or a symbolic invention by iconophile scribes is still debated by modern historians, but the image has embedded itself into the folk imagination, like the story of a blind king who once wanted the whole empire to see no divinity. At this point, the emperor issued decrees. Monks were forbidden to travel in groups, no prayers allowed in gatherings of more than 3, and anyone found keeping holy images would be judged on the spot without a public sentence. Do you hear it? These aren't just laws. They are the voice of someone afraid. Afraid of light, afraid of images, afraid of memory, and deeper still, afraid of forgiveness. One autumn night in 775, as the conflict with the Bulgars intensified in the north, Constantine, nearly immobile, declared he would personally lead the campaign. Some said it was courage. Others whispered he'd rather die on the battlefield than in bed, stared at by the invisible eyes he once tried to erase. And so the emperor, his body ulcerated, his eyes milky, his heart cracked with obsession, was carried on a stretcher, veiled, out of Constantinople. A strange procession, guides afraid to lead, soldiers afraid to look up, and in the campaign tents, his rasping breaths drowned out the wind. As the army neared the frontier, he could no longer speak clearly. At times he called for his father Leo. 3 other times he mumbled the names of long-dead generals. Once, he asked, who turned off the light, though it was midday. Servants said his eyes, or what remained, no longer reflected light at all. And then, on the morning of the 14th of September, 775, in a small tent heavy with incense and the scent of dried blood, Constantine V let out a long, final rasp and went still. No one dared declare him dead until a whisper reached Constantinople. The dragon has stopped breathing. You see, there was no tolling bell, no grand funeral mass, no weeping, except for the wind tearing through canvas. An emperor who once defied heaven itself was defeated not by enemy armies, but by what he had always denied, the enduring presence of memory. And if you're still awake, we'll meet again in the next part when we follow his coffin back to the city, among confused stares, half-drawn curtains, and candles lit not so much for mourning, but to push back something colder than darkness. Constantine's coffin was not welcomed as a symbol of glorious return. No cheers from the people, no flowers strewn in his path. Only the sound of hooves on stone, wheels clattering over old cobbles, and eyes peering from behind half-closed shutters. Can you picture it? A silent funeral procession entering Constantinople, as if carrying home something forbidden rather than a national memory. His body was wrapped in imperial purple silk, but the scent of myrrh and cinnamon couldn't mask the stench of a death too slow, too painful. Chroniclers wrote that his corpse had to be bound in layers of perfumed cloth and resin to hide the unmistakable signs of decay. An unnamed monk recorded later. No one looked into his face when casting the death mask. They had to use old paintings. And then, the funeral rites, held at the Church of the Holy Apostles, burial site of many Byzantine emperors. His tomb bore no sacred images, no jewel-studded cross. Only a stark inscription carved into stone. Defender of the faith, purifier of the empire. Oh, it sounds mighty, but in the hearts of the people, he had become a fracture. You can feel it. No one said a word, yet the silence of the funeral echoed louder than any bell. A few monks arrived early, standing at a distance, whispering prayers not for him, but for those he had killed. A small group of other monks, who had lived in hiding for years, took this moment to step into the open for the first time. They didn't come to mourn, but to declare the curtain of fear had fallen. And then, strange stories began to spread. Some claimed that the very night after the funeral, icons once burned started reappearing in small villages. Others swore they saw a discarded cross take root and bloom. People began to hold quiet, nighttime prayers. In a remote monastery, a painting of Christ hidden behind plaster for 3 decades was unearthed, its colors still fresh, as if just painted. Believers in signs called it the miracle after the dragon's death. Skeptics called it memory resurrected. Modern historians, more cautious, simply say, a reign ended, and memory, however, repressed, was always waiting for its moment to return. And what of the court? The generals, officials, and clergy who had served Constantine now began adjusting. Some quickly declared they were just following orders. Others wrote letters to the new emperor Leo IV, Constantine's son by his third wife, pledging loyalty and washing their hands. Leo, though newly crowned, understood clearly that he could not continue his father's exact path without tearing the empire apart again. Leo IV became known as Leo the Mild, because he did something Constantine never had. He compromised. He didn't immediately restore icon veneration, but he quietly halted the persecutions. No more raids on monasteries. No more bizarre trials over embroidered crosses on napkins. The empire exhaled. Maybe you did too just now. Interestingly, it was Constantine's death that opened the door to the return of the icons. Not through war, not through rebellion, but through the slow decay of a body that had rejected all images of the sacred. There's one final anecdote not officially recorded, but widely passed down, that a painter, living in a small Thracian village, created a strange image, an emperor in purple robes, his eyes hollow, touching a painting of Christ. At the edge of the canvas was a small carved inscription. He broke the image. The image did not break him, but it waited. Of course, you're still awake, and the story isn't over. Because you can't talk about Constantine V by speaking only of his pain and death without also acknowledging the force he was, the power he embodied, like a thundercloud, stretched over the Byzantine Empire for 3 decades. A time when many sighed in relief that the empire didn't collapse but dared not sigh too loudly, afraid to disturb the laws of a ruler too alert and too obsessed. Now let your shoulders relax. Take one gentle breath and imagine you are living in Constantinople in the 750, a splendid, bustling city. But beneath the marble, stucco lies an entire system of governance powered by fear, ruthlessness, and trembling ink upon imperial edicts. Constantine wasn't just a suppressor of religious symbols. He was a master of administrative structure. After quelling rebellion and securing the throne, he set about reforming the state in full, militarized empire fashion. One of his most lasting legacies was the expansion and strengthening of the theme system, where local government and military power were fused. It made the army more loyal, more responsive, and more tightly controlled. No longer could regional commanders launch independent rebellions as in the past, because now the names, property, and bloodlines of every officer were all recorded in files stamped with the imperial seal. Do you feel that chill down your spine? An empire where you could survive if you knew when to stay silent. He also reformed taxes not by raising them, but by tightening their grip. Land was resurveyed, the population meticulously recorded, and any region that failed to pay taxes for 3 consecutive seasons would be merged into a neighboring military district. In his eyes, money was a weapon, and taxation had to function like military orders, precise, non-negotiable, and with no exemptions, not even for monasteries. In fact, especially not for monasteries. On the urban front, he repaired the water systems, reinforced roads, connecting Constantinople to Thrace and Asia Minor. Small hydraulic projects, barely remembered by name, saved thousands from famine during failed harvests. That's the paradox. A ruler who built bridges and burned paintings. One hand raising dikes, the other shutting the doors of churches. A particularly fascinating but often overlooked detail. Constantine was deeply invested in internal espionage. Not in the sense of dramatic spy stories, but in a system of inspecting monasteries, reviewing sermons, even transcribing local priests' homilies for analysis. There was a secret department dedicated to monitoring religious morality, reporting directly to the imperial office, independent from bishops and patriarchs. This reveals something essential. Constantine didn't trust anyone outside the grasp of imperial authority, from merchants, farmers, and priests to members of his own family. Modern historians still wonder, was he simply a man with an extreme security instinct, or had he been through so much rebellion that he lost the ability to believe in loyalty altogether? Some sources say that even after being sworn fealty by generals, he demanded they send their sons to the capital as political hostages. Prevent again, and control was the only faith he had left. But do you know what's strangest? Under his rule, Byzantium truly was more stable. It didn't fracture as it had under previous emperors. It didn't fall apart in both east and west. Victories against the Arabs in Syria and successful suppression of internal revolts made Western dynasties like the Carolingians under Charlemagne take notice. Constantine himself was once called the final shield of Eastern Christendom. One Armenian chronicler wrote, "He ruled like a spear, holding enemies at bay while piercing the hearts of his own people." A powerful image and a haunting one. And of course, everything comes at a price. Beneath the golden polish of political order was a cultural wound that never healed. Thousands of icons destroyed, hundreds of monastic libraries burned. Generations of painters, monks, and scholars lost not because they rebelled, but because they painted sacred faces. And perhaps you, listening now in the quiet of night, are wondering, is ruling by fear always more effective than ruling with kindness? And if so, why do rulers who rule through fear always seem to die in the loneliest ways? Don't answer yet. Let that question linger, like incense smoke that hasn't quite faded in a cold stone palace. Because in the next part, we will look into the lives of those who lived under Constantine, not the emperors, but the people. What they felt, how they lived, and what they prayed for when night fell and silence pressed in. You're still there, aren't you? Beneath the soft blanket, the dim light, and that quiet, rising feeling inside you. Like standing in an ancient temple, where the whispers of old souls still echo in the stone. And this time, we won't speak of emperors. We'll speak of those who lived in their shadow, the people who didn't write history, didn't wield swords, didn't wear crowns, but were still there. And still remember. Imagine you are an ordinary resident of Constantinople in the year 755. A tanner, a vegetable vendor, or a junior monk living in a small monastery on the outskirts. Every morning, you rise when the church bell tolls not to attend Mass, but to check whether the icon in your home has been discovered. Because under Constantine's rule, owning a religious image could be seen as an act of rebellion. Some people drew tiny icons on the inside of their garments, where no one could see. Others carved saints' names into the handles of wooden knives. And notably, many began writing prayers onto bread, then eating it, as a way to keep God in their hearts without leaving any trace behind. A parchment scroll from Cappadocia recounts the tale of an old man who, each night, would open a small curtain over his window, face west, and silently pray before the shadow of an icon that had been removed. He said, "Daylight brings fear, but in darkness, memory returns power." The people didn't revolt. They didn't raise spears against the state, but they had their own form of resistance, surviving through memory, holding on to faith through silence. And that silence was what Constantine feared most, because he could burn icons, exile monks, and silence preachers, but he could never control what people believed with their eyes closed. There's a folk story that in a small coastal village, after a statue of the Virgin Mary was smashed, the people gathered the shards, mixed them with clay, and made rice bowls. Each time they ate, they whispered, "We still eat from her hand." Was it real? Perhaps no one knows. But you see, the more faith is oppressed, the more it transforms. It never disappears. It just finds new forms to survive. And what about the monastic orders? Monasteries were burned, monks arrested, scriptures confiscated. But what remained were memory and oral tradition. Some elder monks withdrew into seclusion, teaching a handful of young disciples in old wine cellars, where a charcoal sketch hung on the wall, no colors, no gold leaf, just faint lines. But every child who looked at it knew, this is the face of Christ. A strange story from an anonymous monk recounts that, during Constantine's final years, many underground monasteries began writing scriptures on linen, sewing them into nightgowns. They called it the armor of silence. Each night, they slept with God's words pressed against their skin, a form of resistance made of dreams. You can see something clearly. The empire was organized by law and soldiers. But life beneath it among the people was organized by faith and memory. Constantine's reign made Byzantine society feel like a play of opposites. On the surface, people bowed to imperial portraits. Beneath the floor, they hid icons behind bricks. In the market, they talked about the weather. In the kitchen, they whispered psalms into their breath. And at night, the city fell into a particular kind of silence, not the peace of safety, but the silence of a song being held back. Constantine ruled for 3 decades, long enough to extinguish a faith. But instead of extinguishing it, he only drove it deeper, quieter, more enduring, like roots threading their way through stone. And after his death, those roots began to rise slowly, steadily, and irreversibly. You see, an emperor can rewrite history in chronicles. But the people are the ones who preserve memory in fabric, in song, in sleep. Are you ready to go deeper? In the next part, we'll turn to another side, how Constantine was seen through the eyes of his enemies, exiled monks, and his own successors. Because an emperor can be, but his shadow never quite disappears. Not everyone hated him. That's right. It might sound strange, but in the eyes of the military elite, Constantine was once the ideal emperor. To them, he wasn't the icon burner, but the city's defender. His victories over the Arabs, his campaigns against the Bulgars, and the tightly organized theme system he created made many generals see him as a kind of Iron Man of Byzantium. Not graceful, not pleasant, but effective. There are even handwritten documents from the Anatolic theme that once referred to him as Constantine the Unyielding, a wordplay that was both respectful and slightly dramatic. Folktales claimed that some soldiers believed he was chosen by God, not for holiness, but for his ability to wield fear as a military tactic. You see, among the soldiering class, people didn't need holy icons. They needed discipline, steady pay, and someone who could keep the empire from collapsing. And Constantine delivered. At what cost? To them, it didn't matter much, so long as the road stayed open and the wall stayed standing. But what about those who fled from him? Some monks, priests, and even nobles who supported icon veneration fled westward. Many reached Rome, where the Pope at the time, who had little love for Constantine, welcomed them. There, Byzantine clerics told tales of the Eastern court as if recounting a dark fairy tale. A mad emperor, a man who burned churches, who banned children from being named after saints, who had his eyes consumed by his own sins. These stories seeped into the Western epic tradition. For centuries afterward, Constantine V was referenced in religious texts as a god betrayer, an Eastern Judas. Some depictions even showed him bound beneath the feet of saints, eyes oozing, hands clutching his head, a symbol of what happens when a king abuses power to oppose the faith. Then came his successors, those who couldn't ignore the blazing legacy he left behind. His son, Leo IV, as you already know, stepped onto the throne wearing a cloak heavier than gold. The suspicion of courtiers, the fear of the people, and the enormous shadow of a father both praised and cursed. Leo IV chose to walk the middle line. He didn't dare restore icons publicly that would anger the generals still loyal to his father. But he also didn't continue the persecutions too harshly because he saw clearly, if things went on like this, the empire would lose its soul. So he quietly withdrew many of the harshest policies. The ban on icons in private homes was lifted. The surveillance of prayers ceased. He released some imprisoned monks, and he let the people remain silent in their own way. It was a first step, and that small step opened the path to the eventual revival of sacred imagery in the following century. Under later rulers, especially Empress Irene, and the Council of 787 icon veneration was officially restored. Monasteries were rebuilt. New frescoes emerged, not only more vibrant, but infused with compassion for the pain of the past. Some painters even quietly began to depict what they had witnessed during Constantine's reign. Scenes of monks under interrogation, icons being pulled down, sanctuaries shattered. But they painted not out of hatred but remembrance. A strange tale is told of an ancient monastery on Mount Olympus, where a painting showed a dragon engulfed in flames at night surrounded by silent saints. No signature, no known artist. But in the corner of the canvas, nearly faded, a small inscription reads, "You burned me in fire, but memory lives in ash." And you know what? Perhaps, in the end, Constantine V was never truly forgotten. Not loved, but not erased. He lives on in paintings, in legend, in nights like this when you listen, when you remember. Because sometimes, death doesn't end a person. Only forgetting can do that. And Constantine was not forgotten. Not by the saints, not by the people, and more importantly, not by someone like you, still quietly listening in the middle of the night. And if you're still awake, still tuned in to the whisper of imperial memory, then there's one more thing we haven't mentioned, something quiet but woven into every corner of life under Constantine V. We've spoken of the military, of religious persecution, of the fear threading through stone walls. But there's one more element, something that made his reign not only fearsome, but durable: law. Because if an emperor is the one who ignites the flame of power, then law is that flame forged into a blade, and Constantine held that blade with both hands, steady, firm, and unflinching. You ask, how did he rule the empire? Not through trust, not through persuasion, but through structure, surveillance, and punishment. From the earliest years of his reign, Constantine understood. To unify the empire ideologically, the church and army alone weren't enough. He needed law, not soft law, rigid law. Detailed, unforgiving, and rooted deep into every local tier. A hallmark of his rule, the regularization of everything. In legal matters, Constantine V followed in the tradition of Justinian I. But instead of expanding the code, he refined and tightened it. Fragmented rules, gray areas in religious legislation, all of it sealed shut with new decrees. For example, one law during his reign stated that anyone holding a private prayer gathering without central church oversight could be punished as a political threat. It sounds minor, but imagine if you were a mother praying for your soldier son without a certificate, you could be interrogated. Constantine's laws didn't just target elites, they went straight for the common folk. He didn't care who you were, as long as you stood outside the structure of control. Moreover, he implemented an extremely detailed system for recording crimes and sentences. Local judges were required to send quarterly reports to the capital. A wrongly applied punishment, a judgment that omitted the emperor's name, could lead to an investigation. Many local officials weren't removed for corruption, but for issuing verdicts without invoking Constantine in the record. You see, this wasn't law for justice. This was law for authority. A little-known fact: he was among the first emperors to standardize seals and legal documents. Every judgment, order, and administrative text had to bear a unique seal, embossed with the imperial eagle, or inscribed with the phrase, "By the decree of the purifier." Yes, he called himself that, the purifier. And he didn't stop there. Under Constantine, the law spilled over into civilian life. Marriages had to be registered not just with the church, but with the military district. Naming a child required approval from an authorized list. In some regions, funerals had regulations: who could cry, how many could attend, and even the length of the eulogy to prevent rituals from stirring dissenting emotion. Was it too severe? Historians still debate. Some say he cleansed chaos with disciplined law. Others argue he turned law into shackles for the soul. One of the most controversial examples was the law concerning internal espionage within monasteries. Constantine allowed any believer to report a monk if they exhibited forms of icon veneration, and if the accusation succeeded, the monk wasn't only punished, the entire monastery's property could be legally confiscated. Efficient, legal, no torture needed, just the right form. But don't be mistaken, his legal system wasn't chaotic. On the contrary, it was tight, clear, highly enforceable. It's just that no one dared to enforce it incorrectly, because fear was the cushioning beneath every letter. Under Constantine, law wasn't a fence against evil. It was a mold to shape obedience. Can you feel it? The entire empire, like a cold mechanical engine. No oil, no slack ropes. Every cog was a law. Every lever, a decree. And the man at the helm was no kindly king, but a totalitarian engineer. An engineer who could press faith into molds that served his purpose. And if you think this only happened in the court, wait for the next part. Because we're about to look at the lowest rungs of the empire. Slaves, non-Christians, those who had no right to venerate icons because they never had icons to begin with. It's another world, quiet and forgotten. But they, more than anyone, bore the deepest scars from Constantine's reign. You're still with me, aren't you? Then lie still. We're about to descend deeper into the empire. A level where no light reaches, but memory still breathes. Because under Constantine V, while emperors and priests fought over images, while generals read decrees beside the fire, there existed another class, voiceless, faceless, undocumented. They were slaves, non-Christians, landless laborers, people on the margins of every reform. They didn't care about icons, not because they were irreligious, but because faith is a luxury when you don't even have shoes to wear to church. Imagine it. You're an Armenian woman, captured and enslaved after an uprising near the border. You're brought to Constantinople, working in the home of a wealthy official. You can't read. You're not allowed inside the church. You don't dare lift your eyes when passing the emperor's statue. But you listen. You feel. You understand that the images people display or hide matter deeply. And you grasp something more profound. Behind every religious war lies a quieter war for survival. Constantine's empire was tightly structured, like an enormous bureaucratic machine. But its gaps, the places the law ignored, were where the smallest people struggled to live. And in all the decrees on land, taxes, religion, and the military, there was barely a word about slaves. They weren't protected by law. They weren't permitted to keep icons. And of course, they weren't allowed to dream. Records note that in the 760s, during widespread inspections for illegal icons, a group of Greek slaves secretly painted the Virgin Mary's face using soot and wine on the back wall of a stable door. That painting, it said, lasted only one night, erased the next morning by the householder. But the strange thing? An orphan raised in that home later told the story to a chronicler, and that image lived again in a handwritten psalter nearly a century later. The icon may have burned, but the memory smoldered on. And what of the non-Christians? The Muslims living in the outer quarters, the Jewish merchants in the market, or the folk beliefs that survived in the Thracian mountains? To Constantine, they weren't worth exile, but neither were they worth converting. He simply omitted them from his religious vision. But you know, neglect is also a form of power. While great churches lost their icons, and smaller chapels received no funds for repair, some non-Christian groups began passing down their own symbols, not to defy the emperor, but to preserve a belief they didn't dare name. And then there was another group, the internal exiles. Former priests, former scribes, former scholars who, after the purges, buried themselves in new identities. A once proud scribe now made shoes. A former preacher quietly taught letters to a merchant's children. They lived. They wrote, but never tilted their pen too far. And in those classrooms, tiny symbols were etched behind the slate board. Poems were slipped silently into lessons, each a quiet reminder to future generations. There was a time when we were allowed to believe. You see now, Constantine V ruled with iron, but iron could not crush the darkness where buried memories lived. His laws were as firm as stone, yet even in the cracks of that stone, grass still grew. And it was the people at the very bottom of society, those uncelebrated by history, without monuments, without records, who preserved the soul of the empire from being erased. Not through icons, not through words, but through silent faith. And if you are still here, still listening, still lying quietly in the weightless night, then you're hearing not just a story, but a whisper stretching across centuries. A reminder, not every king is immortal, but every memory burned, buried, or erased finds a way back. You're not asleep yet, are you? Your eyes may be slowly closing, but your mind is still drifting with the shadows of quiet figures, silent footsteps echoing through the corridors of an empire that has long since fallen asleep. And now, having walked through the lives of those humble souls under Constantine V's reign, perhaps it's time to return to one very simple but deeply haunting question. All of it, for what? Because in the end, every law, every persecution, every decree about icons and belief control led to one goal: stability. But stability by what measure? And was it truly achieved? In truth, Constantine V was not merely a destroyer of icons. He was also a sweeping administrative reformer. Under his rule, the military was reorganized, finances were audited, and the bureaucracy was trimmed significantly. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Like today's austerity campaigns. But instead of slogans, Constantine used ledgers, inventories, and merciless cuts. A little-known detail: under his rule, imperial inspection teams were established groups assigned to travel the provinces and monitor local officials. They had no troops, no judicial authority, but one weapon more dangerous than any sword: the right to report directly to the emperor. And any official named in such a report rarely got a second chance to explain. Some modern historians have compared that system to corporate internal audits, structured, coded, and complete with tiered disciplinary mechanisms. Constantine, as you can see, wasn't exactly a king of the faith. He was an autocratic CEO running a massive corporation called Byzantium. But here's the irony. Even after all that, the empire still cracked. Small revolts began to stir on the Balkan frontiers. In Syria, garrisons complained of delayed food supplies. In the West, whispers of restoring icon veneration began to rise again. And in the heart of the capital, a slow fatigue crept into the people like winter fog. Because an empire can function with discipline, but it cannot live on fear forever. A refugee monk once wrote, not with mockery, but with strange compassion, "People did not weep for the icons destroyed. They wept because it had been so long, since anyone dared sing a hymn aloud." Do you understand? When faith is pressed into the chest for too long, it does not vanish. It becomes silence. And silence, if held long enough, becomes weight. And the death of Constantine V, as we told at the beginning, did not come from battle, nor from assassination. It came from within, bit by bit, when pus began to ooze from his eyes, when his vision vanished, when the fever would not break. Historians no longer needed metaphor. For a king blinded by maggots was already the clearest image of a dynasty that had lost sight of its own path. And later, when his body was taken to be buried, the people did not gather in crowds. There were no hymns, no grand funeral procession, only a silent column, a sealed coffin, and an atmosphere as if the entire city had just exhaled. Not out of triumph, but because an era of control had just closed. Yet the story of an empire does not end when a king dies. It merely turns the page. And in the case of Constantine V, his death was not a period but a comma in a sentence filled with even more contradictions. Because the one who inherited his throne was his own son, a young emperor bearing a name too heavy to carry, Leo IV. That name once belonged to his grandfather Leo III, the man who launched the first wave of iconoclasm. And now Leo IV stepped onto the throne with both inheritances. On one side, the iron whip of his father. On the other, the sacred shadow of his lineage. It wasn't easy. When Leo IV ascended in 775, Byzantium felt like a body just unwrapped after a long surgery. No more blades, but not healed either. The people exhaled. The monks listened closely. And the generals remained loyal to Constantine's hardline policies. So what did Leo IV do? He chose silence. He issued no orders to destroy more icons. But he didn't restore them either. He did not continue persecution as his father had. But he didn't reopen the abandoned monasteries. This was the era historians often call the stillness before change. Leo IV was like a man who inherited a fire already burning too hot. He dared not add wood, but lacked the strength to put it out. And in that silence, something curious began to happen. Not from the throne, but from the empress. Leo's wife, Irene of Athens, was not only intelligent and resolute, she carried within her a dangerous secret for the court. She was a supporter of icons. Beneath the robes of an empress, Irene quietly placed like-minded allies in court positions. She raised her son in the spirit of moderation. She worked in silence and waited. Some say even Leo IV himself didn't truly believe in icon destruction, but under pressure from the military loyal to his father, he maintained a neutral stance. But other historians counter, Leo IV simply wasn't strong enough to do anything else. You see, even in silence, there is dispute. Even after a grotesque death, power does not rest. And thus, the empire entered a new chapter. Without Constantine V, but with his fingerprints still everywhere. On the walls of empty churches, in the wary eyes of the monks, and in the restless dreams of a young emperor, both the son of a hated man and the father of a ruler yet to be born. Beneath the golden domes of Constantinople, where the walls still echoed with the footsteps of Constantine V's power, a new generation was beginning to stir. No one dared speak his name aloud anymore. They called him the Purifier, the Blind One, or simply the Darkness. And yet, curiously, though everyone wanted to forget him, they continued walking the roads he laid down, decrees still in effect, laws still unrevoked, and scars that would not heal in the memory of an empire. Leo IV ruled like a man walking on thin ice. Beneath him lay the fractures his father had left behind. Above him loomed the eyes of the court, the military elite, and a people so accustomed to fear that it had become the air they breathed. But there was one thing Leo did not recognize, or had no time to understand. His silence did not heal the wound. It merely pressed it deeper, waiting to surface again. In his short reign, Leo IV caused no upheaval. But that very indecision made him the bridge between two epochs, one of fire, one of dawn. And the one who crossed that bridge was none other than Irene. She didn't need soldiers. She didn't shout slogans. She simply changed things from within. A post reassigned, a new advisor appointed, a small gospel book quietly placed on the young prince's desk. The transformation did not happen in the public square, but in the silent corridors. And each night, as the empress walked past the cold walls where sacred images had once been scraped away, perhaps she whispered the one truth Constantine never grasped. No image is truly erased if it is still held in the heart. Leo IV died young, before he could answer his own question. Could he be Constantine's son without becoming his shadow? But after him, Irene was not merely a regent. She ruled and ultimately became the first woman in Byzantine history to reign in her own name. A woman who once embroidered sacred symbols onto vestments now issued the decree to restore holy images. And so the wheel of history turned in a paradoxical arc. An empire once trembling in fear of icons now saw them painted again by the very hand of someone who once lived beneath the hand that banned them. Not through rebellion, not through military victory, but through something Constantine could never control. Faith without a voice. You see, a painting can be shattered. A monastery can be burned. But a child, raised during an era of repression, might still remember how their mother once touched an icon hidden at the bottom of a trunk and called it light. And that alone was enough to keep an empire from fading into oblivion. Not because of what emperors left behind, but because of what the people refused to let go. If you're still awake, then remember this. History is not what's carved into stone. It is what survives through silence. And Constantine V, for all his power, could never defeat that. A strange thing happened after the death of Constantine V, something official histories rarely mention. It wasn't collapse. It was silence. As if the entire empire was holding its breath. No one dared speak too loudly. No one dared write too directly. The stone walls, once trembling under the sharp voice of the emperor, now stood still in a thick quiet. But beneath the earth, under the paving stones of the streets, memory was still moving slowly, deliberately. And in that silence, a new generation began to grow up. Children once taught to tear down holy images had become adolescents. Some of them may not have understood why their grandfather's name was whispered like a curse, but they listened, and they began to ask questions. In small schools behind churches, teachers, once students of exiled scholars, began to teach concepts the court didn't forbid but didn't encourage either. They spoke of inner light, of images in the mind, of how you do not need to see a picture to know God is watching you. These words were seeds. They didn't bloom immediately, but one day, they would. Some monasteries quietly came back to life, not with gold statues or grand sermons, but with people. Surviving monks returned with silver hair and softer voices. They no longer preached with thunder, but with survival. They told stories of knights burying books, of friends taken away, of looking at a scraped-off icon and still seeing the eyes of Christ. And through all of it, Irene waited. She knew one could not reverse a fury with a single gesture. She let change seep like water into stone, slow but sure. She had abandoned warehouses turned into small libraries. She ordered theology classes, reopened for noble youths. And then, she waited for the moment when faith no longer had to hide. In 787, the Second Council of Nicaea was convened. Once more, sacred images were called by their names. And this time, there were no worms, no death warrants. Only a quiet return of what had been driven to the deepest corners of memory. And you know what? In one corner of that council, it's recorded that a painter, brought back to restore the icons, whispered to his son, "I do not paint God. I paint what people have not been allowed to see for too long." That is how faith returns, not through power, not through declarations, but through calloused hands, through memory, through the human heart. And so, Constantine V no longer wrote the story, but he still lingered like a shadow behind every image being restored. Not to curse, but to remind us, even the most ironclad empire cannot shackle light if people still wish to see. But the story didn't end there. What followed the Second Council of Nicaea was not just the restoration of religious images, it was the reconstruction of collective memory. As churches were painted anew, artists didn't simply recreate saints and angels. Some quietly added strange details. A faceless crowd, a blindfolded man, an unfinished brick wall behind the Virgin. These weren't in any theological canon, but those who had lived through Constantine's time understood. They were symbols of fear, of absence, of years when belief was banished from the light, and in the remote countryside where iconoclast laws had arrived, last faith bloomed first. In one village in Cappadocia, people held sacred vigils, not with loud hymns, but by lighting hundreds of oil lamps atop broken tile shards from destroyed icons. They called it the Night of the Shards, a ritual of both repentance and defiance, saying, "Faith may scatter, but it never disappears." Elsewhere, a new form of poetry emerged. Memory. Not hymns, not odes to glory, just small, quiet things. A monk keeping a piece of cloth with a faded cross. A mother clutching her child while avoiding the emperor's statue. These fragments became threads that bound the present to a past buried in silence. Some women, nuns, and scribes were soon known as mnemophiliacs, keepers of memory. They didn't preach or lead prayers. They told what happened when the icons fell, who disappeared, who refused to sign the destruction orders, who hung the last hidden image, not for judgment, but for remembrance. Because to forget, they believed, was the gentlest and most dangerous form of betrayal. In stone carvings from the early 9th century, many small churches did not name Constantine V as a heretic, as some had hoped. They simply left a blank space, a cold emptiness between two kings. But that blank was the truest punishment of all, because no one fears being named as much as they fear being omitted. You see now, The return of the icons wasn't just the return of images. It was a kind of collective healing, a nation learning to look again at the bare walls and finally speak aloud what had long gone unspoken. So every new painting on a church wall, a vestment, or just within the mind became a whispered prayer. We are still here, even if we were once told to forget. And now, as this story winds its way through layers of stone, through cracks in memory, through the whispered breath of a fallen empire, you're still here, lying quietly in the dark, listening. There are no more swords, no more edicts, no more walls scrubbed bare. Only a long silence like the final breath of a night centuries past when a stone empire tried to crush faith beneath law and dissolved in the very silence it had created. Can you feel it? That this story, though ancient, is not so far away? That the forbidden, the broken, the buried always find a way to return? Not through force, but through memory, through whispers, through dreams. So if tonight you dream of an icon behind a plaster wall, or hear footsteps in a cold stone hallway, don't be afraid. It's not a ghost. It's memory knocking once more. And if you press your hand to your heart and find something unnamed still stirring there, know this. You are keeping something sacred. Now, close your eyes. Let the final images drift like incense smoke. Sleep as if you are resting beneath ancient vaults, hearing the echoes of generations past, and knowing nothing truly vanishes. As long as someone remembers. Good night. And if you dream of the light still glowing in the ashes.